Hi, I'm Dan and I'm here from Fender Musical Instruments Corporation. I'm the product manager for Fender electric guitars and basses in Europe, and I'm excited to be here at Muziker today to talk a little bit about our latest iteration of the Vintera range, Vintera III. Now, vintage reissue instruments like the one I'm holding here offer a great opportunity for you to own a really cool vintage style electric guitar that faithfully recreates what came in the past without breaking the bank, like you would do if you were to purchase a true vintage instrument in a lot of cases. Vintera is a range produced in our Ensenada, Mexico facility and has been around in a few different guises since the late 1990s. Classic series, which you may have heard of, was introduced in the late 90s, and since then has been refreshed into the new Vintera line, which is where our Ensenada price point electric guitar with a vintage style lives. So these have been around for a little while. The big change with Vintera III versus the outgoing Vintera II range is that we've moved away from focusing on full decades, and we've focused and zoomed in on specific parts of each of those decades, the 1950s, the 1960s, and to a lesser extent the 1970s as well. By zooming in on specific periods of each decade, we're able to focus the specs and really hone in on what makes those eras of guitars great, and make a much more vintage accurate version of those instruments. Of course, through the decades, through the 50s, 60s and 70s, a lot changed. A Stratocaster from the early 60s to the late 60s is a very different guitar. There's different construction methods, there will be very different specifications, and that will give you a very different flavor of the Stratocaster. So it's important that we hone in on specific eras within those decades to get a more vintage accurate guitar. Some of the key upgrades and features on these guitars are revoiced and redesigned pickups. The pickups across the Vintera range are designed to really faithfully recreate the pickups of that specific era using the same magnet type, Alnico magnets. You'll see formvar wire or enamel wire on decade-specific models. The cable's cloth wire inside. You'll also see fiber bobbins just like the original pickups. So very, very faithfully recreating those vintage pickups we know and love. You'll see neck specs that are true to the vintage guitars. So across the range, you'll see 7¼ inch radius. You'll find vintage tool frets, as well as specific neck profiles in each guitar that mimic those you would see on that specific era of guitar. These colors really faithfully recreate the vintage car colors you would have seen on a vintage Fender electric guitar as it was when it left the factory. So really cool looking finishes. Dakota red model is particularly gorgeous. You'll also see decals on the guitars applied over the finish, just like they were back in the day. And you'll also see redesigned decals so that they more closely match the era that we're going for with each individual guitar. So as you move through the 60s and into the 70s, you'll see things like patent numbers on the front of the decal, all this kind of stuff. The kind of things you would find on a real vintage spec guitar. Each of the models now also has a bone nut, which is more faithfully accurate to how a vintage guitar would look, feel and sound. Bone nuts offer more stability, they're more durable, they sound great. Tons of players look for that kind of spec. And so they're on as standard on every model. Now, in terms of componentry, you'll also see true vintage style components on these guitars. You will see things like bent steel saddles on a 6-point synchronized tremolo system. On some of the offset models, you'll see things like bridge mutes, so on the Jaguar and on the Bass 6 as well. So really true recreations of what you see on vintage instruments. You'll also see more accurate neck constructions on each of these guitars. With guitars from the 50s, for example, you'll see one-piece maple necks. On more 60s models, you'll see round laminate fingerboards. So round laminate rosewood boards or round laminate maple cap boards. And this is a new feature that we can offer from Ensenada in Mexico. We've never done it before, but it more faithfully recreates how a guitar would have been constructed from that era, with a thin veneer of rosewood on the fretboard, as opposed to a slab board, which was something more focused in the earlier 60s. So first up, we've got the late 50s Stratocaster. This model features an alder body, a D-shape, a late 50s D-shape neck profile, which is really, really comfortable. You'll find vintage tool frets, so very similar to what you'd see on a vintage guitar, as well as a 7¼ inch radius. And the neck construction is a one-piece maple. The decal is applied over the finish and has the signature with synchronized tremolo text embossed on there, just like you would have seen in a later 50s guitar. You'll see a 6-point vintage synchronized trem system with bent steel saddles that have Fender patenting printed or stamped into each of the saddles, a feature that was obviously apparent whilst the patent for the design was still pending. You have a single ply white pickguard, just like you would have seen in the late 50s. And you'll also have 3 Alnico 5 single coil pickups. Now these with Formvar magnet wire, cloth wire for connecting to the electronics, as well as unbeveled but staggered pole pieces as well, just like you would have seen at the time. The pickups sound great. They really do sound like a kind of late 50s Strat guitar. Very, very cool. One of the only things, and this is a core feature across a lot of the models in the range, one of the things that we deliberately haven't recreated is the wiring type on these guitars. So a late 50s guitar, or many 50s and 60s Fender electric guitars, or Strats in particular, will have a 3-way selector switch and a more vintage style of wiring, so different control layout. These guitars will have a 5-way switch, 5-way selector switch, which is one of those things that a lot of people would swap out on a vintage guitar anyway. You get a 3-way switch, you'll put a 5-way in, so you don't have to balance precariously between each pickup selection to get those tasty Strat sounds. Also, controls are modern, so it's a modern wiring layout. So you have master volume, you have a tone control that controls the neck and the middle pickup, and then you'll have a tone control on tone 2 that just controls the bridge pickup. Again, one of those wiring mods that so many people apply to their vintage guitars. And so we figured, let's just do it for you out of the box, instead of having to go and throw away your 3-way selector and rewire your guitar. So these have a more modern wiring and control layout. Really great, but let's have a listen to see how it sounds. So that's the late 50s Strat. We'll move forward a decade to this other guitar, the late 60s Stratocaster. So the late 60s Stratocaster has obviously the same, Strat style body, alder body on the late 60s Stratocaster here. but under the hood, there's a lot of key differences. Neck construction here, you'll find a 60s C-shape neck profile, which is very comfortable and reminiscent of the era. You'll find vintage tool frets, as well as a 7¼ inch radius. On the board here, this is a guitar with a round laminate fingerboard. As we mentioned earlier, round laminate is more in keeping with how the guitars were produced at that point. And you'll be able to see this by looking at the head cap area. You can see there is a curve where the fretboard is installed on the guitar. And you can see that at the butt of the guitar as well. If you take a look at the butt of the neck, you'll see that there is a curve in the fretboard there. And that's the first time we've done that out of our Ensenada, Mexico factory. So really, really big news. Up until now, they've only produced guitars with a slab fingerboard. And so this is quite an exciting new feature that more faithfully recreates a vintage guitar. On the 60s Strat, you'll see pearl dots as opposed to the black dots on the maple fingerboard. Also on the late 60s Strat, we've paid attention to the diameter and the spacing of the dots on the face of the fretboard. So you'll notice you've got pearloid dots here, and they're slightly closer together. The spacing is slightly closer than you would see on an earlier 1950s guitar. Very, very cool. The decal on our head cap here is a mid-1960s, what we call a transition logo. This was actually a logo that began to appear on jazz basses in the early 60s, but more and more Fender instruments received this kind of decal towards the mid-60s. It ended in the later 60s. This guitar is really based on a Stratocaster from around 1966, where you would have seen this style decal and these kind of style pearloid dot inlays. Very, very cool. You'll also see on the decal, we've included all the pattern numbers, just like you would have seen on those original guitars with that style of decal. You also have a bigger headstock, so a headstock that's synonymous with the 1970s, which began to appear on Stratocasters in the mid to late 60s. It's a very, very cool spec there. On the mid-60s model, you also see the F tuners, the kind of F-stamped tuners that you'll see on later Strat models, and an F-stamped neck plate as well. Very, very cool. The pickups in these guitars are different to the 50s. They're still with Alnico 5 magnets, but you'll find it plain enamel wire for the magnet wire on these guitars. They're still with cloth wire underneath. The pole pieces are still staggered, so you get a very different kind of flavour with the mid-60s Strat to what you'd hear on the 1950s. Very cool. We've also opted for a more modern approach to the wiring in these guitars. So you'll find a 5-way selector switch, so you can access 5 different sounds. You'll find master volume control, tone control for the neck and for the middle pickup, and then also a tone control for the bridge. You'll also see Fender stamped bent steel saddles and a 6-point tremolo system too. So all those things that people love about this era of Strat. Next up, we're going to look at some of the Telecasters from the Vintera range. This year, 2026 is the 75th anniversary of the Telecaster. So a really big deal for us. And we want to celebrate that by introducing some new Telecasters that really kind of speak to the history of the model from each different era. This model is a late 50s Telecaster. Late 50s or mid to late 50s, Fender moved away from the vintage kind of blackguard, black pickguard aesthetic and moved towards the single ply white pickguard. That was around about the time that the Stratocaster was launched. And so this model looks to replicate guitars from that era. So the around 1956, 57, 58, that kind of era. This model has either an ash or an alder body, depending on the color that you go for. This blonde guitar will have an ash body. The transparent or translucent finishes will have that ash body, whereas if you go for some of the solid colors, you'll find an alder body instead. The guitar, interestingly, features a really nice neck profile, a late 50s V-shape profile, which is obviously a V shape, slightly less chunky feel than you would get from an early 50s Tele, which will have like a U shape. Some people refer to it as a baseball bat neck. So these guitars are very, very comfortable, but it's noticeably more chunky than you would get on a more modern Telecaster with a C-shape neck profile, that kind of thing. So really cool guitar to pick up and try. It will also have a 7¼ inch radius with vintage tool frets, so to replicate what the guitar would have felt like back in the 50s. Black fret dots on this guitar. Bone nut, as is standard across the Vintera range. You'll also have a later 50s Telecaster decal, which is repositioned relative to where an earlier 50s decal would be, and a butterfly string tree, as opposed to a disc string tree that you would have seen on an earlier 50s Telecaster. The neck is a one-piece maple neck with that V-shaped profile. So very comfortable and a similar construction to what you would have seen on a true vintage instrument. And the pickups in these models are late 50s Tele models. So you'll have Alnico magnets in these, Alnico 5 magnets. You'll also have unbeveled but staggered pole pieces on the bridge pickup, and plain enamel wire on these models as well, which is reminiscent of that era. You have a 3-way selector switch, which works as you'd expect for a modern Telecaster, so not so vintage in this respect. Just like the Strats, we wanted to make sure that these were really usable for modern players and would give people the sound that they expect. So you will find a master volume, master tone, and a 3-way selector switch to control bridge and neck, and then neck pickups as well. So all that full fat Tele feel, usability that you'd expect from a modern guitar in a vintage aesthetic and a vintage sound. Another key difference between this and an earlier 50s Tele, you'll find steel saddles as opposed to the brass saddles from earlier, and you'll also have the Fender patent pending stamp on the bridge plate there as well. Very cool guitar. Let's have a listen. So we'll move on from the late 50s Tele now on to the mid 60s Telecaster. I think this is my favourite from the line. I'm a sucker for a 1966 style Tele. This model is indeed based on a 1966 model. You'll notice immediately the guitar has that transition decal that we talked about with the 60s Strat earlier. You'll see that larger, kind of more blocky Fender logo, still in gold, with the pattern number below the Telecaster logo there as well. Very, very cool. Again, the logo here is applied over the finish, just like you'd see on a vintage guitar. We'll start by talking about the neck on this guitar then. So the back shape on the neck is a mid-60s C shape. So very, very comfortable and a big contrast to what you'd see on the late 50s Tele. Very, very different feel. You'll have a bone nut, as is common across the whole range. A round laminate rosewood fingerboard or a maple cap fingerboard on the blonde model. As with the other Telecaster, you'll see either ash or alder bodies, depending on the finish. This is a solid, or this is a metallic color finish, a solid finish. So you'll find an alder body on this model. This model in Fire Mist Gold is a fantastic example of some of the custom color options that Fender offered through the late 50s and 1960s. Fire Mist Gold, a car color from the US in the 60s. This was one of those popular options from that catalogue, and really, really looks the part, just as they would have done when they left the factory in the 60s. This model also features a 3-ply parchment pickguard, as well as vintage style pickups. So in this, you'll find Alnico pickups with staggered pole pieces on the bridge. You'll find plain enamel wire, just like you would see on a vintage pickup of this kind of era. The control layout is the same as you'd see on the late 50s Tele, so you'll have a 3-way selector switch, volume and a tone control as well. So just like you'd expect a Telecaster to work. You'll also have pearloid dots on this rosewood fingerboard. The pearloid dots, slightly different diameter and slightly different spacing of the nut as well. You'll notice that there's a slightly wider spacing. So we've really paid attention to detail on these models to get them as faithfully correct as we can. You'll find a different bridge plate on this model too, compared to the 50s Tele, where you'll have the Fender stamped ashtray bridge, also with patent numbers in there, so post the approval of the patent. You'll also find threaded steel saddles too, so there's a channel for each string to pass through as it goes through the bridge. Cool, let's have a listen to see how this sounds. These 4 guitars that we have with us today are just a small snapshot of what Vintera III series offers. There are many more models, a greatest hits collection of Fender electric guitars and basses through the 1950s, 1960s and to 1970s. Some of the guitars that we don't have with us today are an additional early 60s Stratocaster model, offset models in the Jazzmaster, Jaguar and Mustang, We also have a comprehensive selection of basses too, with an early 60s jazz bass, late 60s precision bass, early 70s jazz bass, and a 60s bass 6. So something for everyone, lots on offer. The offset models feature a selection of custom colours from our custom colour catalogue in the 1960s, with a selection of matching painted head caps too. These guitars look great. They feature the rhythm circuit just as they would have done in the mid-1960s. Our Jaguar model really faithfully recreates that of a vintage mid-60s Jaguar model, and even includes things like a bridge mute, which is a common feature of guitars from that time. It's also the first time that we've added that component to a guitar from Ensenada in Mexico as well. So really interesting new upgrades. The Mustang model comes in red, white and blue, just as they did originally, and will feature things like clay dots on the fretboard and an original dynamic vibrato. The bass selection moves all the way from the early 60s to the early 70s. You'll see things on the early 60s jazz bass like dual concentric knobs, a slab rosewood fingerboard, which is correct for the period that the guitars were originally built. The late 60s precision bass is particularly interesting. We have a great looking model in black with a black matching head cap. The model features round laminate fingerboard or a maple cap fingerboard, depending on the colorway that you choose, as well as lollipop tuners, which are a really cool feature that was only apparent on jazz basses and precision basses for a short period in the 1960s. The early 70s jazz bass offers the more familiar control layout from a jazz bass, with 3 controls as opposed to the 4 dual concentric controls that you see on the early 60s jazz. The bass 6, also very, very cool, bridging the gap between electric guitar, electric bass, features a bridge mute. Again, something that was commonplace on early models, but something we haven't offered from Ensenada, Mexico before. Thanks so much for watching us today talk about the new Vintera III series from Fender. If you're interested in vintage guitars that won't break the bank, then get yourself to Muziker to check out this new range, which is available now.